Hey, hello everybody. Welcome to Saturday or whenever you're watching this video. So my goal is to keep this no more than 30 minutes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a little bit about an overview of advocacy strategies for policy change and talk a little bit about what you're going to be doing for the next 2 weeks in terms of the assignment that's connected to developing your advocacy plan. So ideally you have the PowerPoint. Obviously it appears on the screen, but you have the PowerPoint, so if you need to take any notes, obviously feel free to do that. So let's move on. So what I've done here is I've just pulled a bunch of pictures from last year. So some of these faces, for those of you in the 2-year program, might look familiar. Most of them come from Social Work Day at the Capitol, although one's from Disability Day at the Capitol, and then one's from, I guess, just working in our class. So you kind of get a sense there was great energy. Lots of people were connecting with various legislators, and you will see the person who appears very prominently is Governor Tim Walz. And I hope we'll have a private audience with Tim Walz for our entire school social work department. And you'll also see that Peggy Flanagan appears as well. And you see pictures of some students having conversations, and what they're doing is they're talking to the legislators about their issues. So I hope that serves as a little bit of inspiration. I had posted an announcement just reminding you or asking you or encouraging you to take pictures when you're engaging in your work. And so some of those pictures will appear in your final presentation, group presentation, about what you did. Okay, so I'm going to start with just talking a little bit about the next assignment in the policy advocacy project that you're engaging on. And I'm going to and I was going to do 2 separate presentations, but we're just rolling it into one. So I had mentioned in class that I'm redesigning sort of how we do this. And so what I'm trying to do is cut down on writing papers, formal papers, and to create an alternative way for you to document what you're learning and then use that information in the development of your advocacy plan. So the way that we used to do this is students individually did their readings and documented their learning, and then they came together and collectively pulled all those ideas to write a formal paper. So we're not doing that. If you go to D2L under week 8 and 9, I've combined them on D2L, you'll find the assignment instructions, which is a 2-sided document that lays out the assignment instructions, and then you'll find a worksheet where you're going to record your new understanding. And you please use the worksheet and follow the directions. I'm asking you to write learning statements that are grounded in what you read, and you should all know that grounding means you're identifying some specific information from the reading, you're providing that page number, and then you're going to be explaining some information around that based on the prompt that I've provided. And so for each of these statements, it's a 3 to 4 sentence statement that you will type. And again, this is an individual assignment. So you'll each collectively do some of your own individual learning, and then as the instructions note that when we return to class on March 21st, you'll bring those to class, and those will really be the tools that we use to talk about how you're going to develop your specific advocacy plan, and we'll start doing that actually in class on March 21st. You'll see that please follow the steps as they're outlined. So I sort of begin with you reviewing the chapter that Michelle and I wrote. Specifically, it says in the instructions, a specific set of pages 40 to 53 that introduce the 3-prong model. And then it has the week 8 and 9 readings that may not be in the order that they're listed in the syllabus, but just follow the order on the assignment. And then I found 5 different TED Talks. They're somewhere between, I think, like between 13 and maybe 18 minutes each, to try to make the subject matter kind of come alive. So, again, follow the order. And so that's going to be the policy advocacy assignment. A piece of that is the individual research. Then you'll develop a group plan. We'll do that collectively. I'll support you in developing that plan, and then you'll implement that plan. And I'll talk more about that in class on March 21st. So your job is to think about the possibilities for what you can do, but we need to be anchoring that or grounding that in the literature. So I've provided just a couple definitions of advocacy. One comes from our Reich book, which entails speaking up, pleading the case for another, or championing a cause, often for individuals or groups unable to speak out on their own behalf. And we have talked about, though, that most people we need to be supporting, right, and speaking on their own behalf. Self-advocacy. The other definition comes from Barker's Social Work Dictionary, and it does make a connection there, as you can see, to the NASW Code of Ethics. It's a basic obligation of the profession and its members to engage in advocacy. Our class is about class or cause advocacy, right? We're engaging in public policy related advocacy on behalf of either a cause, which is your issue, or a class. And what that just means is a group of people. So for example, the group that's working on disparities in the child welfare system for African American families, children, parents, and families, that's both cause and class advocacy. Cause because you're trying to address disparities in the child welfare system, in particularly child protection system, and you're focusing on a specific class or group of people. And I just want to highlight that, what we're doing is turning private troubles into public issues through proposing public policy changes. And I just want to make a quick connection to, we've been talking about persuasion. So advocacy is essentially trying to persuade, right? So we're trying to persuade others about what public policy should be, what our proposed solution should be to a problem that's impacting a group of people in our society. So we really want to think that advocacy is so much about persuasion, in exerting our influence aimed to changing behavior towards support for a proposed change. We'll use this in class a little bit, and I'll just sort of explain this. And I can't tell you 100% where I learned this, but I think I think it was Marcia Avner, but I can't tell you for sure. So the idea is around advocacy is we're trying to persuade people through connection, and we can make connections through on the issues, interest, values, capacity, and commitment. And so that little stick figure represents sort of where we're trying to make these connections. So issues is sort of the head, means like it's our thinking. Like we want to connect with people on the issue. We use facts. We use number data. We do use our research, and we try to make a case that we can impact people sort of intellectually, right? Our thinking space. But that's not insufficient. We have to have that information, but we want to move issues to interest. And what that means is that what we really are trying to do is move issues to self-interest, like why you should care about something. And that's connected to the gut or a feeling center, right? You connect through stories, right? And we connect through trying to help people understand and feel like, right? Make this feeling connection. So that's the gut. And values is the heart. And we've already talked about your writing a values proposition statement. And we want to think about our social work values, right? We're not value neutral, but we're trying to understand how do we connect with other people around their values. And so values become really important. Capacity has to do what we're able to do, so the use of our hands, although for some people there are other ways in which people do the doing. I have a colleague who I served with on the Minnesota Council on Disability, and her feet essentially were her hands. But the idea is we want to connect with people. What can you do to move this issue forward, right? What do we need you to do to achieve our goal or our outcome? And then commitment is the feet. Or, if you're in a wheelchair, it's the wheels. The whole idea is we're trying to move people to take action. So if you identify what it is that you want somebody to do, right? And that, let's just say you want them to sign on a bill, right? As a supporter, right? Commitment is the actual taking of that step. It's like you have the capacity to help move this bill through the legislature, and this is what we need you to commit and actually do. So that's kind of how I like to think about as you're framing your issue and engaging in your advocacy, is we really need to make these multiple connections. Most of the slides are going to come from a different policy book that I used to use, and so I think they provide a nice framework that you can use to read the Rice chapters. So steps in advocacy and they're not necessarily always linear. We want to identify what the issue is. We want to research the issue, get the facts, get the data, get the stories. We want to identify broad scope of stakeholders. So you've been thinking about who your stakeholders are, decision makers, allies, people who can champion your cause, potential or known opponents, or people who you might be opposed, right? Foes. We need to frame the issue in a way that we think will persuade decision makers, that will persuade allies to join the cause, that will persuade key stakeholders to champion our cause. We need to connect with core allies around our issue. We need to get the issue on the agenda of public policy makers through relationship building. And so we've identified for many of your issues where they're at in this public policy making process. And for many of your issues, they're already on the agenda of our public policy makers. And I think the other key there is it is about relationship and building relationships. So later on March 21st, when Alicia Munson and Cody Olson come to talk with us, they'll talk a lot about the relationships that they've been building. That's the sort of the essence of their work. We need to set clear goals and expectations for what it is that we want. What is it that we need to do now? What is it that we need to try to work towards, and have a plan in place? Develop that plan, take action, and evaluate. And so when you're engaging in public policy work, you're constantly taking, what do we need to do? Implement it, evaluate it. What worked, what didn't work, what do we need to do as our next steps? And you need to engage in ongoing communication with your allies, with people who are working and joining on this issue with you. So again, they're not necessarily uniformly, sort of a linear, but they are the basic steps of what you want to do. And so we've been engaging in those basic steps throughout the entire semester on your project. I want to just highlight here, and I think I might have shown this in class, and I'm going to just talk again. This links us to thinking about two things. One, stratification, and what that means is like who is involved in the making of public policy. So below that dotted horizontal line are people who most often are not engaged in a lot of public policy work. They're not oftentimes sought out. They may be dismissed. And there are people who we oftentimes are making public policies for, and that fall under the category of public assistance programs, and we should not be surprised when those programs oftentimes have very punitive policies embedded within them. And then as you go up, and this would be on the far left-hand side, you'll see that organized workers, professionals, executives, sort of the wealthy, people who shape the public policy, right? They frame the problem. They're oftentimes very much engaged in that early formulation process around what the problem is and what the solution should be. And then we move into the legislature and passing of actual legislation, and so, right, and we have paid lobbyists that are doing advocacy, and we have grassroots lobbyists doing advocacy, trying to shape that public policy that comes out at the other end through signing bills into laws. And then we move into the rulemaking. We move into the execution of that public policy. And now we have a different set of players who are involved in the implementation of that public policy. And ideally, these public policies are being evaluated, and these research studies that come from organizations like the Government Accountability Office or the Congressional Budget Office, or university think tanks feed and shape that. But the real point I want us to be mindful of is if we're not engaged in grassroots advocacy, and if we're not a part of the advocacy process, you can bet that people who are not directly connected to these issues will be advocating, and they'll be doing it based upon their own self-interest. So this is the three-pronged advocacy campaign model that I teach. And so again, going back to the chapter that Michelle and I wrote, you were introduced to that three-prong. We're always educating and we're always disseminating information, but we need to be engaging with coalition building and grassroots organizing. We need to be connecting with public policy makers, engaging public policy advocacy, and we need to be using traditional and social media to be spreading our messages. Your Rice chapter will talk a little bit about strategies versus tactics. So the strategy is like the overall approach, you know, and what you're trying to achieve, and the tactics are the specific activities. So for example, a strategy that you may use would be, we're going to go to Social Work Day at the Capitol to engage in some grassroots organizing, to get people to lobby, speak with their elected officials around our issue. Okay, so that's a strategy, right? Grassroots organizing at Social Work Day at the Capitol. Or so grassroots advocating, let me step back. Grassroots organizing with social workers, right? We want to get social workers on board on our issue. And a tactic is, we're going to go to Social Work Day at the Capitol. We're going to have our table. We're going to be having one-on-one conversations with social workers, students, faculty, and practicing social workers, right? We're going to give our 2-minute elevator speech, right? So that's tactics, and we'll talk more about that in class. So the next several series of slides talk about each of the three prongs. So I'm starting with coalition building and grassroots organizing. And you already are familiar with coalitions to the extent that, you know, your issue, you've been asked to try to identify, is there a group working on this? Is there a coalition? So for example, the group that's addressing issues of affordable and accessible housing, right? There's a Homes for All coalition. Okay? So a coalition is really basically an organization of organizations that come together with the ideas that collectively they will be more powerful. So they are going to unite around a common goal to change public policy. And oftentimes coalitions, most often, they're invited, meaning your organization is invited to join our coalition. You're invited to join because you share our values, you share our sort of worldview, and that we want you as a partner in advocating on behalf of whatever the issue is. Coalitions can form in the short term to work on one issue. Coalitions can form in the long term to work on ongoing issues. So there's an organization called the Consortium of Citizens with Disabilities in Minnesota. It's a coalition, essentially, a consortium. They exist in the long term, and then each year they talk about what their priorities are going to be, and then they focus on advocating on those priorities. But they don't what's the word I'm looking for? Disband at the end once they've finished working on that issue. So coalitions. And then we have grassroots organizing, which the idea is that, you know, you get a large segment of the community, of people coming together, you know, bottom up, to try to change public policy. So it's individuals and people coming from a shared community, and a community can be a place, it can be geography, it could be grassroots organizing of a group, for example, a group of social workers, right, that come together to advocate on behalf of themselves and other people, you know, to improve the quality of life for themselves and others. Okay. And so the goal is to build collective support for issues, to organize and mobilize for collective action to create change. So organizing, you know, you want to sort of have an organized plan of what you're going to do, and mobilizing means you get people to act when you need them to act. Okay, and so this sort of walks through and helps you sort of think about some of the things that we want to be thinking about when we're engaging in coalition building and grassroots organizing, beginning with who are your allies? Who are people who care about your issue? Who are people who should care about your issue? With the ideas that we're always trying to build a big tent, okay? Grassroots, big tent. Coalitions, you're still trying to create a bigger tent, but you're restricting it to a group of people who sort of have shared values, and that they have particular assets, resources, social capital that they can bring to the initiative. And again, what you're trying to do is take self-interest, because the bottom line is people act based on self-interest to mutual interest. How is this in our collective interest to come together and work on this issue? And so in terms of how do we go about doing this work, what are some of the, and this is how we get to some of the tactics, but identify, build lists, and educate potential supporters. Well, how do you do that? Informational briefings, newsletter articles, special mailings, fact sheets, posters, videos, blogs, individual conversations, presentations, community meetings, town hall meetings, billboards, action alerts, right? So those give you ideas of what are some of the kinds of things that somebody might do when they're trying to reach out and engage potential supporters. You may organize events, marches, rallies, sit-ins, town hall meetings, community summits, benefits, days on the Hill, right? These kinds of events, right, that get people engaged and involved. The next prong is the public policy, advocacy, and lobbying prong. And so lobbying and advocacy are different in the sense that lobbying is part of advocacy, but it's a very specific type of advocacy. Lobbying pertains to you are trying to influence the decision making of public policy makers, right? Specifically, legislators and other government elected officials, right? So you're lobbying them to make a change. And in the chapter that Michelle and I wrote, we do have a section in there that talks about what it is that nonprofit organizations can and cannot do in relationship to both advocacy and lobbying. And part of that is to dispel the myth that nonprofit organizations cannot engage in advocacy. Nonprofit organizations can engage in all kinds of advocacy, and nonprofit organizations can lobby. They're just restricted on how much lobbying they can actually do. So I'm just going to give you an example. Advocacy, you can go to the Day on the Hill, you can talk about issues, you can talk about why it's important to increase funding for something, you can talk about how we should approach addressing the problem of the lack of accessible housing. Advocate, you can advocate, advocate, advocate. It turns into lobbying when you say, we want you to, sign on as a sponsor, as an author of this particular bill. That's lobbying, okay? We want you to vote yes when this bill comes, to come out of committee. We want you to vote yes on this bill. Or when this comes up for a floor vote, we want you to make this amendment, okay? That kind of lobbying has some restrictions for nonprofit organizations, 501c3 organizations, but it doesn't mean they can't lobby at all. There's just some restrictions around how much they can do based upon the size of the organization. And who do we target? Elected officials, legislators, mayors, governors, county commissioners, and politically appointed bureaucrats. So our commissioners of all of our state agencies, and civilian bureaucrats. And we lobby commissioners and civilian bureaucrats to the extent that we want them to understand our issues. We're actually advocating. But as I said in class, they can only advocate for and public policy changes that fall in terms of the state of Minnesota that are priorities for the governor. So our efforts are targeted at how they prioritize the initiatives, proposing, supporting, amending, and defeating legislation, allocation of funds, and the writing of rules. Okay, and I've given you some tips, obviously, and you've all been doing this. We have to do your homework on the issue right? We've been doing that, but on the policymakers themselves and what their connection to the issue is, and have they gone on any record on this issue, and again, finding champions. Don't dismiss based on party affiliation or ideology. That doesn't mean that it isn't possible to make a connection to a legislator who might support and be in support of your issue. And then listed there are a whole array of ways in which you can communicate with public policymakers in terms of advocating and then specific lobbying. And so in your policy advocacy plan, you're going to be starting to think about, well, what exactly is it that we're going to be doing, knowing that you will have a policy advocacy brief, and you will be able to use that to create other tools to engage both in your grassroots organizing as well as in your public policy advocacy and lobbying. And this here on the PowerPoint is a link to Social Work Day at the Capitol 2014. And it was, it's raising the minimum wage in Minnesota. And I was there with a group of students in 2014 advocating on behalf of that issue. The third prong is the media prong, both traditional media and social media. And so what are you trying to do? Well, you're always trying to educate and raise awareness, right? But you use the media as a grassroots advocacy and lobbying method. You use this as a way to spread your message. You use this as a way to indirectly communicate with public policymakers. You use this as a way to mobilize in your grassroots advocacy. So we'll talk first about what's considered traditional media. Newspapers, trade publications, radio programs, television, and you often want to try to see if you can pitch a story to reporters, to columnists, to hosts, right? And so, you know, you may want to, well, I'm going to be encouraging all of you, right, to think about what media outlets and how might you use those media outlets. And I think I mentioned that last year, one of the students in the class just contacted KMSU Radio, talked about their issue, and got on there and was interviewed and did it, you know. And so there'll be opportunities for that, for something like that. News releases and press releases to get information out to the media, to cover your rally, to cover your day on the Hill, to cover your march, to cover your sit-in, or to to care about your issue. Op-eds are opinion editorials, and they're generally written by people who are considered to have some expertise in the paper, and then letters to the editor. And I'm going to be encouraging you all to think about doing that. And most newspapers have a letters to the editor section, and it's a good way, again, to talk about your issue to an audience of people who use the traditional media, whether they get the actual physical paper or whether they get their news online. And then we have social media, social networking sites like Facebook and LinkedIn, blogs, podcasts, Twitter, YouTube, and we get media attention through our collective action and social action, right? We alert the media, and we alert through our grassroots organizing for an event, right? For a march, for a rally, for a sit-in, for a town hall, right? So we use that. And when Alicia comes, in particular, I've asked her, and I think Cody, they're going to talk about how they're using social media in their public policy work. It's not an area that I am real strong on, although I'm going to be working on learning how to use Twitter, and we'll talk about using Twitter. But it can be very effective to follow legislators, to follow issues, to send out messages, to engage people, like call your legislator, or there's, send a letter or show up at the Capitol, right? So social media is becoming really, really important in public policy advocacy. And I'm going to close with, there's a Macintosh article that I'm going to ask you to read, which I think I've already referenced, and you probably already have read it at this point this semester. But the idea of silence is not golden. Silence is interpreted by people in positions of power as being in agreement, not as being in opposition. And so, when we're silent, it means somebody else is doing the talking for us and may not be doing the talking in the way that we want them to. So taking no action is an action. Again, that comes from Macintosh. And so I've just put up that graphic from the chapter Michelle and I wrote, which I think we have to edit because they don't like the images, but I do. Right, what we're trying to do in this class is, right, get educated, which we're all doing, get empowered, and I guarantee you that through some of the things that you do in the advocacy, it will give you a greater sense of power, personal power, interpersonal power, socio-political power. Get connected. Most of you are getting connected, right, with people who care about your issue. Be a connector and an initiator for change. Get political and take action. And there's our reference list. And so your next steps is to go through and do some of your independent learning through reading the chapters, watching the TED Talks, writing up your new understandings, following the prompts, and we will use all of this collective knowledge and wisdom and understanding to develop your collective advocacy plan, and we'll use this to do some advocacy around your issue. So thanks everybody. Have a great spring break. And I will see you on March 21st. Oh, I should say one other thing. I'm working on the policy briefs, so don't worry. I will be working on them and getting them back to you. And so that's it. Thanks, everybody.